Front of the vehicle, lights and reflectors. The lights on top there, they're all clean, clear, not cracked, none are loose, none are missing. They're all the proper color, which is amber, none are obstructed, and they're securely mounted. Same's true on the mirrors. The light reflector there is clean, clear, not cracked, not loose, not missing, or obstructed. It's securely mounted. And the light and reflector right here is also clean, clear, not cracked, not loose, not obstructed at all. It's the proper color, which is amber. Those bulbs too, none are loose, none are missing, none are broken or cracked. They're securely connected and they're proper color, which is amber. My headlights here too are clean, clear, not cracked. They're not obstructed at all, and they're securely mounted. The mirrors right here, the mirrors, it's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. There's no broken or missing welds right there. There's no missing nuts or bolts or any gaps around here. The housing up here is not damaged at all. It's not broken or cracked at all. It's not loose. Also, the lenses right here, they're clean, clear, not cracked, not missing, and they're securely mounted. Engine compartment, oil level. This yellow dipstick right here, that's where I'll check my engine oil. I'll do that while the engine's off. I'll remove that dipstick, wipe it clean, reinsert it, pull it back out. It should be above the add line. If not, I'll add oil up here at the cap. The cap's not loose or missing, it's not cracked or leaking, it's securely mounted. Coolant level. I'm going to check my coolant level while my engine's off. It should be above this add line and below the max line up here. If it's below the add line, I'm going to put coolant up here. The cap there is not loose or missing. It's not cracked or leaking. The reservoir is not cracked or leaking. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. This electrical line is securely connected. There's no cut or exposed wires or any sonic corrosion. There's no loose or missing hose clamp down there. There's no abrasions, bulges, cuts, not cracked or leaking. All of this here is securely mounted. Power steering fluid. This is my power steering fluid reservoir. On the manual here, I can check it while the engine is off. It should be above this cold line here and below the warm or hot line up here. If it's below this cold line right here, up here at the cap, I'll add it while the engine's running. The cap there is not loose or missing. The gasket there is not cracked or leaking. This reservoir is not loose. There's no missing bolts right here or any gaps up here. The reservoir itself is not cracked or leaking. There's no loose or missing hose clamp right there. There's no abrasions, bulges, cuts. It's not cracked or leaking. This metal line is not bent, broken, or cracked or leaking. All of this here is securely mounted. Water pump. This is my water pump right here. It's at the bottom of the V of the drive belt right here. That water pump right there is not damaged at all. It's not loose. It's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts. It's not cracked or leaking at all. My water pump is belt driven. The belt right here is not cut, torn, or frayed, and it's the proper tension, no more than 3/4 of an inch when pushed by hand. My water pump here is securely mounted. This is my alternator right here. My alternator is not loose at all. It's not twisted or sagging in any weird way. It's also not dented, bent, broken, or cracked, or damaged at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. My alternator here is belt driven. The belt's not cut, torn, or frayed. It's also the proper tension. When I push by hand, there's no more than 3/4 of an inch of play. Those electrical lines over here on this side, they're not loose at all. They're securely connected. There's no cut or exposed wires or any sonic corrosion. My alternator here is securely mounted. Leaks and hoses. I'm going to inspect all these electrical lines to make sure they're all securely tied up. None of them are dangling loose to get caught up on the engine or on any hot parts at all. I'm going to inspect all my hoses and all my metal lines to make sure they're securely connected. There's no loose or missing hose clamps at all. The hoses themselves, there's no abrasions, bulges, cuts. It's not cracked or leaking. The metal lines themselves, they're not cracked or leaking at all. Up here at the top of the motor, I'm going to make sure it's not cracked or leaking. Over here by the oil field, it's not cracked or leaking. Or on the front of the motor, it's not cracked or leaking. Up here by the radiator, I'm going to make sure it's not cracked or leaking at all. Up here at all, I want to make sure everything's securely connected up here. Also, there's nothing cracked or leaking or dripping on the ground at all. Here down by the washer fluid, nothing's leaking at all. Nothing's leaking over here. There's nothing puddling on the ground at all or leaking or dripping at all underneath my vehicle. I'll inspect over here to make sure there's nothing dripping or leaking at all. Everything here is securely connected. There's no loose or missing hose clamps. There's no abrasions, bulges, cuts. Nothing's cracked or leaking up here. Up here, I'm going to make sure there's nothing leaking up here. There's no abrasions, bulges, cuts, not cracked or leaking up here. Up here, I'm going to listen for any air leaks and look for any liquid leaks. And here by the air compressor, this copper line right here, I'm going to make sure it's not bent, broken, or cracked or leaking at all. I'm going to listen for air leaks right here. My air compressor is right here. My air compressor here is gear driven. It's not bent, broken, or cracked or leaking at all. I'll listen for any air leaks and look for any liquid leaks. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. My air compressor here is securely mounted. Steering box and hoses. This is my steering box right here, and these are the hoses going into the steering box. The steering box here is not loose. It's not damaged at all. It's not dented, bent, broken, or cracked. There's no missing bolts here, any gaps down here. Up here, it's not cracked or leaking at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. There's no loose or missing hose clamp right here. There's no abrasions, bulges, cuts, not cracked or leaking. This metal line is not bent, broken, or cracked or leaking at all. All of this here is securely mounted. Steering linkage. This is my steering shaft. And right over here is my pitman arm. And right down below right here is my drag link. My drag link, my pitman arm, and steering shaft. My steering shaft is straight. It's not bent, broken, or cracked or damaged at all. Up here at the coupling, there's no missing caps at all, no missing components at all. It's also properly greased. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. My steering shaft is straight. It's not bent, broken, or cracked or damaged at all. And when I twist this steering shaft by hand, there's no more than 10 degrees of play. My pitman arm right here is not loose at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads at all. It's also properly greased up here and also right here. The castle nut right here is not broken or cracked. It's not loose or missing. The cotter key is in place. My drag link right here is not damaged. It's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. It's not loose at all. It's properly greased right here. The castle nut is in place. It's not broken or cracked, loose or missing. The cotter key is in place. My steering linkage right here, and up here are all securely mounted. Tires. I'm going to inspect these tires to make sure that I have the same size and same type of tire on both sides. Also, I want to make sure that they're not recap tires. These have to be virgin tread up here in the front. I'm going to inspect the tread depth to make sure it's at least 4/32 deep, evenly worn all the way around. There's no flat spots on my tires at all. Then I'm going to inspect the sidewalls of my tires to make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. They're not cracked or leaking. I'm going to listen for air leaks. And then I'm going to read the spec on the tire to make sure they're properly inflated. They can't be under or overinflated. And with that pressure gauge right here at the valve stem is not loose. It's not cracked or leaking at all. And the dust cap's in place. My tires here are securely mounted. Rims. I'm going to inspect the rims both inside and out to make sure there's no sign of repair or legal welds. They're not bent, broken, or cracked or damaged at all. And also, there's no gap between the tire and the rim. The tire is evenly sealed all the way around. I'm going to inspect these lug nuts right here. For the manual here, I'm going to remove all these dust caps. I'll inspect those lug nuts to make sure none of them are loose or missing at all. None of them are broken or cracked. None of them are loose. There's no shiny exposed threads. There's no gap between the lug nut and the rim or rust trails. All of my lug nuts here are securely mounted. Hub oil seal. Here on the manual, it's actually a grease seal. I would inspect the hub oil seal or grease seal on the inside of the axle here and the outside here. I want to make sure it's not worn through. It's not cracked or leaking at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. The housing here is not damaged at all. It's not loose, not bent, broken, or cracked at all. Everything here is securely mounted. If I had to add grease, I would remove this cap and add grease right here. Springs and shocks. These are my springs right here, and this is my shock right here. I want to make sure these springs are all straight. None of them are loose or missing. They're not bent, broken, or cracked or damaged at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. My springs here are securely mounted. My shock right here, it's not loose at all. It's not bent, broken, or cracked or damaged at all. It's not leaking at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. There's no gap up here. The rubber bushing up on top and also on the bottom down there. It's not worn through, loose, torn, or missing at all. My shock here is securely mounted. U-bolts. I have a U-bolt right here and also a U-bolt right here. These are not bent, broken, or cracked or damaged at all. There's no gap up here at all. They're not twisted or sagging at all. Also down below, I'm going to inspect those nuts to make sure none of them are loose, none of them are missing, none of them are broken or cracked. There's no shiny exposed threads. My U-bolts here are securely mounted. Spring mounts. I have a spring mount up here in the front, and I'd follow that spring all the way here to the back to make sure that my spring mounts are straight. There's no gap up here. They're not damaged at all, not dented, bent, broken, or cracked at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts at all. There's no gap up here between the frame and the spring mount at all. Also, in between here, I want to make sure that bushing's in place, that metal bushing's there. It's not worn through, cracked, loose, or missing at all. My spring mounts up here in the front and also there in the rear are securely mounted. Brake hoses or lines. This right here is my brake hose. And this line right here, this is my ABS line. My brake hose here is securely connected up here and also to the brake chamber up here. This hose is not loose at all. There's no abrasions, browsers, or cuts. It's not cracked or leaking. And when there's air in this line, I'm going to listen for air leaks. Up here, the ABS line is not loose. It's not going to get tangled up on the ground or the truck or the wheel or anything. There's no cut or exposed wires or any sign of corrosion. My ABS line and brake hose here are securely mounted. Brake chamber. My brake chamber has 3 parts to it. It has a front and a back and a C-clamp right here. The C-clamp right here, it's not twisted. It's not loose at all. It's not bent, broken, or cracked at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. I also don't have any gaps between the brake chamber ends. The brake chamber ends are not dented, bent, broken, or cracked at all. There's no missing nuts or bolts or shiny exposed threads. There's no gap up here around the C-clamp right here, or also there in the rear. My brake chamber here is securely mounted. Slack adjuster and push rod. This is my slack adjuster right here. My slack adjuster is not loose. It's not dented, bent, broken, or cracked, or damaged at all. There's no missing pins or cotter keys up here. It's also properly greased. The push rod here goes inside the brake chamber right here. That push rod needs to go in there straight. It's not bent, broken, or cracked, or damaged at all. When I pull this push rod by hand, there's no more than 1 inch of play, and it's even on both sides. My push rod and slack adjuster are securely mounted. Drums and linings. I'm going to inspect the outside of the drum right here to make sure it's not bent, broken, or cracked, or damaged at all. And also, on the outside, there's no sign of repair, such as illegal welds. On the inside of the drum with a flashlight, I'll inspect it to make sure it's dry. There's no oil or grease. Also make sure there's no sign of repair or illegal welds on the inside of the drum, no cracks, no discoloration or warping. Also, I want to make sure that the linings, the brake lining right here is at least 1/4 inch thick. It's evenly worn all the way around. None of it's loose or missing. None of it's broken or cracked. Any two is dry, no oil or grease. My brake lining here and brake drum are securely mounted.